Originally known by its Gustavo Mello catalogue registry of GM216, the small and unassuming system of Pioneer was the first solar system beyond Centrum ever reached by humans, with ships of the fledgling CDF Discovery service reaching it on the 62nd of Solstice 017 PCU, after a successful transit through the very first driftgate, built on the 5th libration point of the planet Destrum. Chosen for harbouring the most promising Centrum mass exoplanet known at the time to be within range of the first generation of driftgates, the third world around Pioneer was indeed habitable, albeit under a very lenient definition of the word. Pioneer 3 is tidally locked to its parent star, one side perpetually illuminated by it, and the other immersed in eternal night, with the temperature gradient between the day and night sides driving intense, powerful gales from the cold face through the twilight terminator band and toward the hot starward face, where the moisture brought with the winds precipitates under the substellar point in a never-ending storm, after which the planet was named. While by modern standards, Storm would be barely considered survivable, let alone habitable, the drive of early Centran spacefarers to tame a world outside their own solar system proved too great to restrain. Under the perpetual swirling cloud blanket of the substellar point, the heat normally trapped by Storm's thick atmosphere is partially abated as starlight is reflected off the clouds back into space, which, aided by the rainfall, stays at an amenable 60 degrees centigrade. Areas closer to the terminator, not under the protective cover of the overcast, approach temperatures in excess of 100 degrees centigrade. The saline water of the lakes kept liquid only by the high atmospheric pressure raising its boiling point. The planet's human settlements are mostly built alongside those lakes and pools around the substellar point, where if not at all comfortable, the temperatures are at least livable, and water and energy are plenty. Hundreds of wind farms closer to the terminator, where winds are strongest, capture and harness the powerful gales for use by the colonists, while the best location for the construction of these aeolic turbines, from a power output standpoint, would be the terminator itself. The energy losses from transmitting this power across half a planet force them to be located much closer to the substellar point. Their location also benefits those who work the lakes and aeolic pylons, who often have to travel for hours on foot beyond the shelter of the colony habs through terrain impassable to ground vehicles. Though environmental suits beyond simple oxygen masks are not strictly necessary to survive on Storm, especially on the colder settled region, most will wear one regardless, if only to protect themselves from the sudden horizontal lashing of scalding hot salinated lake water and balmy rainfall mix, burning and searing the flesh of those unfortunate enough to be caught with inadequate protection. While sufficient to make its settlements barely sustainable, the planet's resources, or lack thereof, are not enough to foment the creation of a profitable export market to the rest of the cluster. Hosting a small population for most of its life, Pioneer endures solely through its cultural staying power as humanity's first interstellar outpost. Adventure tourism provides a significant share of the system's income, and its status as an almost sacred site in Centrum's exploration-obsessed culture has curtailed any motion towards its abandonment, no matter how unforgiving and fruitless life there may be. Pioneer's second and more dubious claim to fame is as essentially the birthplace of interstellar piracy. After the settling of Storm, the Assembly laid down plans for further expansion of the Driftgate network, with Pioneer as a forward base from which to expand outward to other promising systems, otherwise out of reach of first-generation gates in the Centrum system. To that end, a sister installation to Centrum's gigantic Hadamus Gate Forge would be built in the Pioneer system, from which new gates could be locally manufactured. Construction of the Yashoda Wainwright Gate Forge began in 021 PCU, with multiple public-private partnerships established to ship equipment, materials and expertise from Centrum to Storm, as well as to establish the required infrastructure for the project. This activity would be short-lived, however, as by the late 20s, theoretical advances in universal relativity had increased Driftgate maximum ranges twofold, making the use of Pioneer as a launch point largely redundant. Construction of the Wainwright Gate Forge was discontinued, and due to the unappealing projected costs of disassembly, the partially completed structure was abandoned in its incomplete state. The following years were similarly unkind to Pioneer. The colonization of Rialtis in 034 PCU, an actually welcoming inhabitable world, and the opening of Keeper's Dance in 042 PCU, with a veritable bounty of natural resources, would largely shift the Assembly's attention away from Pioneer, once a promising outpost of human exploration, now consigned to the role of a glorified display piece, its once bustling activity relegated to a few intermittent tourist ships and routine supply runs. To add insult to injury, the opening of Axios in 051 PCU would suddenly see a renewed influx of traffic into the Pioneer system, but mere itinerant traffic, not bound for Storm itself, simply stopping for refueling and provisions, if stopping at all. Where most in Pioneer saw this new traffic with bitter contempt, Denich Aitken, an asteroid miner who worked the Arberg spread, would see a unique opportunity. Banding together with his shipmates and a few fellow-minded miners, He would go on to create the so-called Crown Skull Buccaneers, targeting small-time independent operators and making sure to avoid ships associated with large corporations and freighter lines. They would then capture vessels and take them to Storm, where with the help of like-minded officials with a similarly poor view of Axios, having been properly oiled by the promise of a fair share of the profits, new papers and transponder codes would be created for the vessel, which would then be resold and the hostages ransomed to the Storm government, to then be repatriated to Centrum or Axios. Unknown at the time to the Assembly was that the hostages were being freely given to Storm officials, whereupon the ransom money requested to the Parliament would be divided between the Crown Skulls and the corrupt local officials. Occurrences were far enough between that losses were chalked up to random micrometeoroid impacts or catastrophic maintenance issues blamed on the private operators themselves, and as small-timers not associated with any financially significant institutions, there was little economic incentive or demand from the powers that be to investigate the disappearances. With the unofficial endorsement of the Storm government, the Crown Skulls eventually took up residence in the husk of the Yashoda Wainwright Gateforge. While their piratical activities had become an open secret throughout the Assembly government, it was an issue that no prime ministerial administration was eager to take responsibility for. The fencing of captured shipping by corrupt officials on Storm had become a significant support to the neglected colony, and by feigning ignorance, the Centrum Parliament was able to procrastinate the greater expense of supporting the colony by more legal means. This repeated prevarication allowed the Crown Skull-occupied Wainwright Gateforge to grow into a veritable fortress, the loss of life in any assault attempt furthering the Assembly Cabinet's eagerness to continually pass the buck to the subsequent administration. Inevitably, the situation ultimately developed to a point where resolving it could no longer be delayed, and on 107 PCU, a CDF force was finally deployed, under the command of legendary post-captain Matthew Cormier, leading to a decisive victory at the Battle of the Wainwright Gateforge. As is often the case, however, once the medals and promotions were handed out and the victory speeches given, both the Crown Skull Buccaneers and the Wainwright Gateforge were quickly forgotten about, and as such both have continued to endure, with the former remaining the most ubiquitous organised pirate group in Tantalus, and the latter playing host to dozens of different groups of reprobates and vagabonds throughout the centuries. Ironically, Pioneer's inhospitable environment and need for self-sufficiency has made it one of the few places in the cluster not yet directly threatened by the Great Famine, but as what was once seen as nothing more than an inhospitable curio has become the last refuge to desperate souls of other Tantalus worlds, many in the southeastern frontier are willing to brave its hellish conditions and the risks of attempted illegal immigration in the hopes of saving themselves from starvation. Tragically, this influx has overtaxed the careful balance of Storm's delicate colony ecosystem, and many media outlets continue to suggest that this may prove an existential threat to Pioneer's future as a settled system. Thank you for watching. You can get the Sojourn through various distributors, all of which are accessible through www.thesojournaudiodrama.com. You can also get the series through Patreon, where you'll be able to access various bonus features, including our visual dictionary, Guinevere cross-sections, and anthology shorts. Remember to join us on Discord and get regular updates on all upcoming Sojourn releases. All the related links can be found below this video. Fair winds.